Faith Norwood's heart raced as she stared into the mirror of her bedroom vanity, her trembling fingers clutching a letter that would seal her fate. Outside, the Colorado sun blazed mercilessly over Pueblo's dusty streets, the summer of 1879 proving to be one of the hottest on record, though not nearly as scorching as the fury building within her. "Promise to Harold Wickett," she whispered, the words tasting like poison on her tongue. At 20 years old, Faith had always known her father might arrange a marriage for her, but not to a man nearly 30 years her senior with a reputation that made even the roughest cowboys in town lower their voices when speaking his name. Faith smoothed the faded blue calico of her dress, wondering how many more days of freedom remained before she would become Mrs. Harold Wickett. The thought alone made her stomach twist into knots. She'd heard the whispers about his previous wives, 3 in total, all dead under circumstances that raised eyebrows but never quite warranted investigation. Harold's wealth and influence throughout the territory ensured that questions remained unasked. A sharp knock at her bedroom door startled Faith from her thoughts. "Faith, your father wants you downstairs. Mr. Wickett has arrived early." Her mother's voice carried through the wooden door, thin and resigned. Faith closed her eyes, willing strength into her bones. "I'll be right there, Mother." Descending the staircase of their modest home, Faith could hear the booming laughter of her father and the lower, raspier tones of Harold Wickett coming from the parlor. She paused at the bottom step, gathering her courage before entering the room. Ah, there she is. Her father, Thomas Norwood, exclaimed upon seeing her. He was a tall man with graying hair and hard eyes that had only grown harder since losing his mining investments 2 years ago. "Faith, come greet your future husband properly." Harold Wickett rose from his seat, his considerable height and girth dominating the small parlor. His salt and pepper beard couldn't hide the cruel set of his mouth, nor could his expensive suit disguise the roughness of a man who'd built his cattle empire through methods few dared to discuss openly. "Miss Norwood," he said, taking her hand in his meaty grip. "You're looking even lovelier than when I last saw you." Faith forced a smile. "Mr. Wickett." "Harold, please," he insisted, his eyes roaming over her in a way that made her feel unclean. "After all, we'll be man and wife in just 3 days' time." "3 days," Faith's voice faltered. "I thought your father and I decided there's no sense in waiting," Wickett said, placing a possessive hand on her shoulder. "I've already had my housekeeper prepare your rooms at my ranch. You'll want for nothing." "Except freedom," Faith thought bitterly. Her father cleared his throat. "Harold has been most generous in his arrangement, Faith. The papers are signed. Your dowry has been settled." The way he avoided her eyes told Faith everything she needed to know. Her hand in marriage was payment for her father's debts to Wickett. "I've brought you something," Wickett said, reaching into his pocket and producing a velvet box. Inside nestled a gaudy diamond ring that must have cost a small fortune. "Your wedding band. I expect you to wear it always." Faith stared at the ring, feeling as though it were a shackle rather than a symbol of love. "It's beautiful," she lied, allowing him to slide it onto her finger. It felt heavy and wrong. "Now, Thomas, if you don't mind, I'd like a moment alone with my betrothed," Wickett said, his tone making it clear this wasn't a request. Her father nodded, ushering her mother from the room. "Of course. Eleanor and I will prepare some refreshments." Once they were alone, Wickett's demeanor changed instantly. His smile disappeared, replaced by a cold, calculating look. "Let me make something perfectly clear, Faith," he said quietly, gripping her wrist tightly enough to make her wince. "I know about your little friend, the schoolteacher's son. Whatever childish affection existed between you ends now. You will be a dutiful wife and you will bear me sons. Any disobedience will be punished. Do you understand? Faith's blood ran cold. She had indeed formed a friendship with young Stephen Miller, though it had never progressed beyond innocent conversations after church services. But the threat in Wickett's voice made it clear he would tolerate no relationships outside his control. "I understand," she whispered. "Good." He released her wrist, his smile returning as quickly as it had vanished when her parents re-entered the room. Faith barely heard the conversation that followed, her mind racing with desperate thoughts of escape. 3 days. She had 3 days to find a way out of this marriage, or she would be trapped forever with a monster wearing the mask of a respectable businessman. That night, after Wickett had left with promises to return the next day, Faith sat at the kitchen table with her mother, who silently peeled potatoes for supper. "Mother, please," Faith pleaded. "You can't let Father do this. Mr. Wickett is. He's dangerous." Eleanor Norwood's hands paused briefly before continuing their work. "Your father believes this is best for everyone. Mr. Wickett is wealthy and established. He can provide for you. His other wives died, Mother, all 3 of them. Accidents happen, Faith. Life on a ranch can be perilous." "You know it wasn't accidents," Faith insisted, her voice breaking. "Please, we could leave. Go to Aunt Martha's in Denver." Her mother set down the knife and looked at Faith with tired eyes. "And live on what? Your father owes Wickett more money than we could earn in 10 lifetimes. This marriage settles those debts and secures our future as well." She reached across the table, squeezing Faith's hand. "Sometimes women must make sacrifices. This isn't a sacrifice, Mother. It's a death sentence." Eleanor flinched but said nothing more, returning to her potatoes. The conversation was over. That night, Faith lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the moonlight casting shadows across her bedroom. She couldn't stay. She couldn't marry Harold Wickett. Whatever the cost, she had to escape, even if it meant leaving behind everything and everyone she'd ever known. Dawn had barely broken when Faith rose the next morning, packing a small carpet bag with essential items. A change of clothes, the few dollars she'd saved from selling embroidery work, and a locket containing miniature portraits of her parents. She penned a brief note apologizing for her actions, but making it clear she could not marry Wickett. The house was quiet as she crept down the stairs. Her father would be in his study, her mother likely still asleep. Faith eased open the front door and stepped out into the crisp morning air. The streets of Pueblo were beginning to stir with early risers, shopkeepers opening their establishments, ranch hands heading to work, a lone stagecoach being readied for departure outside the hotel. Faith walked briskly toward the livery stable, hoping to secure passage on the next stagecoach heading east, perhaps all the way to Kansas City, where she had a distant cousin. She was so focused on her destination that she didn't notice the black carriage until it pulled alongside her. The door swung open and Harold Wickett's imposing figure emerged. "Going somewhere, Miss Norwood?" he asked, his voice deceptively gentle. Faith froze, clutching her carpetbag tighter. I was just taking a morning walk." "With your belongings," Wickett gestured to her bag. "I had a feeling you might try something foolish. Your father warned me about your independent streak." He reached for her arm. "Come, I'll escort you home." "No," Faith jerked away, stumbling backward. "I won't marry you, Mr. Wickett, I can't." Wickett's expression darkened. "I'm afraid you have no choice in the matter, my dear. The contract is signed." "I'm not cattle to be traded," Faith said, her voice rising with desperation. People on the street began to take notice of the confrontation. Wickett glanced around, clearly uncomfortable with the public scene. He lowered his voice to a menacing whisper. "Get in the carriage now, or I'll have your father thrown in debtor's prison before sundown. Your mother will be homeless by week's end. Is that what you want?" Faith felt the fight drain out of her. The threat to her parents was not an idle one. Wickett had the influence to make it happen. Slowly, she stepped toward the carriage. "That's a good girl," Wickett said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "You'll learn that obedience brings rewards while defiance." He let the implication hang in the air between them. Just as Faith was about to enter the carriage, the thundering sound of approaching hoofbeats made them both turn. A rider on a magnificent chestnut stallion came to a halt beside them, dust swirling in his wake. "Morning, folks," the stranger said, tipping his worn leather hat. "Is everything all right here?" Faith looked up at the man, taking in his sun-bronzed face, the quiet strength in his posture, and the kindness in his green eyes that contrasted with the hardness of his jawline. He wasn't dressed like the cowboys who worked the nearby ranches. His clothes were trail-worn but of good quality, and the gun at his hip looked well used but meticulously maintained. "This is a private matter," Wickett said coldly. "Move along, stranger." The man dismounted, his movements fluid and confident. "Seems to me the lady might not be too eager to go with you," he observed, his voice carrying a subtle accent Faith couldn't quite place. "The lady is my fiancée," Wickett said, "and who might you be to interfere?" "Name's Garrett Quinn," the man replied evenly. "Just arrived in town. Couldn't help but notice what looks like a disagreement." Faith saw her chance, perhaps her only chance. "Please," she said to Garrett, "Mr. Wickett is forcing me to marry him against my will." Wickett's hand clamped down on her arm. "That's enough, Faith. Mr. Quinn, I advise you to continue on your way. This woman is promised to me, and we're to be wed in 2 days' time." Garrett's gaze shifted between them, assessing the situation. His eyes lingered on Wickett's grip on Faith's arm, then moved to the fear evident on her face. "Madam," he said directly to Faith, ignoring Wickett completely, "are you being coerced?" "Yes," Faith said, finding courage in this stranger's calm presence. "My father owes Mr. Wickett money and I'm to be payment, but I will not marry this man." Wickett's face flushed with anger. "This is preposterous. I won't stand here being insulted by a drifter and an ungrateful girl." He turned to Faith. "Get in the carriage. Now." "I don't believe the lady wants to go with you," Garrett said, stepping closer. Though he made no threatening moves, there was something in his stance that made Wickett hesitate. "This is none of your concern, Quinn," Wickett hissed. "I'm making it my concern." Garrett's hand rested casually near his holster. "Where I come from, forcing a woman against her will isn't considered gentlemanly behavior." By now, a small crowd had gathered, watching the confrontation with interest. Wickett glanced around, clearly aware of the spectators. His reputation in Pueblo was important to him, and a public scene could damage it. "Faith," he said through clenched teeth, "we'll discuss this later. I'll be speaking with your father about your behavior." He released her arm and stepped back toward his carriage. Before entering, he fixed Garrett with a cold stare. "And you, Mr. Quinn, would do well to learn whose territory you've wandered into. This isn't over." With that, he climbed into his carriage and signaled his driver to depart. The vehicle rumbled away, leaving Faith standing beside Garrett on the dusty street. "Thank you," she whispered, rubbing her arm where Wickett's fingers had dug in. Garrett nodded, his expression serious. "Seems you're in quite a situation, Miss Norwood, Faith Norwood, Miss Norwood." He glanced at her carpetbag. "Were you planning to leave town?" Faith nodded, suddenly aware of the spectators beginning to disperse, some whispering among themselves. News of this encounter would spread quickly in a town like Pueblo. "I can't stay here," she said. "He'll force me to marry him, or worse." Garrett considered this. "You got somewhere safe to go?" "I was hoping to catch the stagecoach east to Kansas City. I have family there." "That stage doesn't leave until tomorrow," Garrett said. "And after this, Wickett's likely to have his men watching the depot. Faith's heart sank. He was right. Wickett controlled too much of Pueblo, there would be nowhere to hide. "Miss Norwood, I'm heading north to Wyoming Territory," Garrett said after a moment. "I've got business in Cheyenne. If you need safe passage away from here, I can offer you protection on the journey." Faith studied him carefully. Accepting help from a stranger carried its own risks, but something in Garrett Quinn's steady gaze made her believe she could trust him. And what choice did she have? "Why would you help me?" she asked. A shadow crossed his face. "Let's just say I've seen what happens when men like Wickett get their way. No woman deserves that fate." Faith made her decision. "I accept your offer, Mr. Quinn. But I should warn you, Harold Wickett is a powerful man with connections throughout the territory. Helping me will make you his enemy." Garrett's mouth curved into a slight smile. "I've made worse enemies, Miss Norwood." He untied a bedroll from behind his saddle. "We should leave now while Wickett's still licking his wounds. We'll need supplies for the journey." "I have a little money," Faith offered, patting her carpetbag. "Keep it. You'll need it once we reach Cheyenne." He mounted his horse and extended a hand down to her. "Can you ride?" "Yes," Faith said, taking his hand and allowing him to pull her up behind him. The chestnut stallion snorted but accepted the additional weight without complaint. As they rode through Pueblo streets toward the general store, Faith felt a strange mixture of terror and exhilaration. She was leaving behind everything she knew, placing her trust in a man she'd just met, and making an enemy of one of the most dangerous men in the territory. But for the first time in days, she felt something that had been missing since her father announced her betrothal to Harold Wickett: hope. Garrett Quinn kept the chestnut stallion at a steady pace as they left Pueblo behind. They had stopped only long enough at the general store to gather necessary supplies: dried meat, beans, coffee, and ammunition. Faith had insisted on purchasing a simple riding dress and boots with her own money, changing quickly in a back room of the store while Garrett kept watch for any of Wickett's men. Now, as the afternoon sun beat down on them, Faith clung to Garrett's waist, her new riding dress hitched up to allow her to sit astride the horse behind him. The impropriety of her position would have scandalized her mother, but such concerns seemed trivial compared to escaping a forced marriage. "We'll ride until dusk," Garrett called over his shoulder. "There's a creek about 15 miles ahead where we can make camp." Faith nodded, though she knew he couldn't see the gesture. The rhythm of the horse beneath her was soothing despite her circumstances, and the vast landscape opening up before them filled her with a sense of freedom she hadn't experienced before. "Have you been to Wyoming Territory before?" she asked, raising her voice above the sound of hoofbeats. "Many times," Garrett replied. "Spent the last few years moving between Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana. There's work for a man who knows horses and isn't afraid of hard labor." "Is that what you do? Work with horses?" There was a pause before he answered. "Among other things." "I was a cavalry scout during the war, learned to track and survive in rough country. Those skills still have value out here." Faith considered this information. Garrett Quinn was clearly a man comfortable with the frontier, likely in his late 20s or early 30s, though the trail life had weathered his features, making his exact age difficult to determine. "And what awaits you in Cheyenne?" she asked. Another pause, longer this time. "A fresh start, maybe. I've been offered a position with a rancher there, breaking horses and helping expand his operation." "That sounds like a good opportunity," Faith said. Garrett made a noncommittal sound. "We'll see. Plans have a way of changing out here." They rode in silence for a while, the landscape gradually shifting from the more settled areas around Pueblo to wilder country. Faith watched a hawk circling high above them, envying its freedom. "Mr. Quinn," she said finally. "I realize I haven't properly thanked you for intervening this morning. You put yourself at considerable risk for a stranger." "Garrett," he corrected. "If we're going to be traveling together, you might as well use my given name." "Garrett," Faith repeated, finding she liked the sound of it. "Still, you should know what you've gotten yourself into. Harold Wickett isn't a man who forgives being crossed. He owns half the cattle in southern Colorado and has judges and lawmen in his pocket." "I've dealt with men like Wickett before," Garrett said. "They think their money makes them untouchable, gives them the right to take whatever or whoever they want." There was something in his tone that suggested personal experience, but Faith didn't press for details. They were, after all, still strangers despite the unusual circumstances that had thrown them together. By late afternoon, the sun had begun its descent toward the western horizon, painting the landscape in gold and amber hues. Faith's muscles ached from the unaccustomed hours in the saddle, but she made no complaint. Every mile put more distance between her and Harold Wickett. True to Garrett's word, they reached a small creek just as dusk was settling in. The water ran clear and cool between grassy banks, with a stand of cottonwood trees offering shelter from the elements. "We'll camp here," Garrett said, reining in the horse and dismounting with practiced ease. He reached up to help Faith down, his hands strong and steady at her waist. Faith's legs nearly buckled when her feet touched the ground, but she managed to stay upright, determined not to appear weak. "What can I do to help?" "You can gather wood for a fire while I tend to Blaze," Garrett said, patting the chestnut's neck. "Stay within sight of camp, though. There are wolves and mountain lions in these parts." Faith nodded and set about collecting fallen branches from beneath the cottonwoods, grateful for the chance to stretch her legs after the long ride. As she worked, she found herself watching Garrett as he unsaddled Blaze and checked the horse's hooves with practiced movements. There was something reassuring about his methodical care for the animal. Once they had a small fire going, Garrett prepared a simple meal of beans and jerky. They ate in companionable silence, the crackling fire and distant calls of night creatures the only sounds. "May I ask you something?" Faith said as they finished their food. Garrett looked up at her across the fire, the flames casting shadows across his face. "You can ask." "Can't promise I'll answer." "Why did you really help me today? The truth." Garrett set his plate aside and stared into the fire for a long moment. "You reminded me of someone," he said finally. "My sister, Rebecca. She was married off to a wealthy rancher when she was about your age." He seemed respectable enough, but behind closed doors. He trailed off, his jaw tightening. "By the time I found out what was happening, it was too late. She died in childbirth 2 years after they wed, though the doctor said her body showed signs of old injuries that had never properly healed." "I'm so sorry," Faith said softly. Garrett nodded, accepting her sympathy. "I was away during most of her marriage, working cattle drives up to Montana. I should have been there, should have seen what was happening." He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling up into the night sky. "When I saw you today, the fear in your eyes, I couldn't walk away." Faith felt a lump forming in her throat. "Thank you for telling me that, and for what it's worth, I don't think you should blame yourself for what happened to Rebecca." "Maybe not," Garrett said, though his expression suggested he hadn't forgiven himself. "We should get some rest. Dawn comes early and we've got a long ride ahead of us tomorrow." He helped Faith set up a simple bedroll on one side of the fire, then moved to the opposite side to prepare his own sleeping area, maintaining a respectful distance that Faith appreciated. Despite the hard ground beneath her and the strange surroundings, exhaustion soon overcame her, and she drifted into a dreamless sleep. The following days fell into a rhythm as they traveled northward, avoiding main roads and settlements where Wickett might have connections. Garrett proved to be a skilled guide, finding water and game when their supplies ran low, and choosing campsites that offered both protection from the elements and a defensible position should trouble find them. Faith learned that Garrett had grown up on a small horse farm in Kentucky before the war, that he preferred coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, and that he could identify any bird they encountered by its call alone. In turn, she told him about her life in Pueblo, her love of reading, and her dreams of someday traveling to San Francisco or perhaps even New York City. On the fourth day of their journey, as they crossed into Wyoming territory, Faith noticed Garrett growing increasingly vigilant, scanning their back trail more frequently. "Is something wrong?" she asked as they stopped to water the horse at a small stream. Garrett's expression was grim. "We're being followed. Have been since yesterday morning, I suspect." Fear clutched at Faith's heart. Wickett's men, likely. 3 riders keeping their distance but definitely tracking us. He handed Faith the reins. "Hold Blaze, I'm going to climb that rise and get a better look." Faith watched nervously as Garrett made his way up a rocky slope, lying flat at the top to observe their back trail through a small spyglass he produced from his saddlebag. When he returned, his face confirmed her fears. "It's them. I recognize one of the men from Pueblo works as Wickett's foreman. They're about 2 hours behind us." "What do we do?" Faith asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. Garrett studied the terrain ahead. "There's a mining settlement called Silver Springs about 10 miles north of here. Small place, but should have a sheriff. We'll head there, try to lose them in the town." They rode hard for the next 2 hours, pushing Blaze as much as they dared given the extra weight of 2 riders. The countryside gradually became more rugged, with pine forests replacing the open plains they'd traversed earlier. By mid-afternoon, the settlement of Silver Springs came into view, a collection of wooden buildings nestled in a narrow valley, with mine entrances visible on the surrounding hillsides. Smoke rose from several chimneys, and Faith could make out people moving about on the main street. "We'll get a room at the boarding house," Garrett said as they approached. "Clean up, get a proper meal, and figure out our next move. With luck, those men will pass through without spotting us." They rode directly to a 2-story building with a sign identifying it as Mrs. Holloway's boarding house. Garrett helped Faith dismount before leading Blaze to the hitching post. A plump, gray-haired woman opened the door as they approached, eyeing them with curious but not unfriendly interest. "Afternoon, madam," Garrett said, removing his hat. "My wife and I are looking for lodging. Would you happen to have a room available?" Faith tried not to react to the wife claim, understanding the necessity of the pretense. Mrs. Holloway looked between them. "Just passing through, are you?" "Yes, madam," Garrett replied. "Heading to Cheyenne. My wife's cousin is expecting our visit." The woman seemed satisfied with this explanation. "I've got 1 room available. $2 a night includes supper and breakfast." "That's fair," Garrett said, producing the money from his pocket. "Much obliged, Mrs." Holloway ushered them inside, showing them to a small but clean room on the 2nd floor. There was a single bed, a washstand with a pitcher and basin, and a rocking chair near the window. "Supper's at 6, she informed them. "Washrooms at the end of the hall if you want to freshen up." Once she had left them alone, Faith turned to Garrett, suddenly very aware of their close quarters. "I'll sleep on the floor," he said immediately, reading her concern. "We should stay here tonight, let those men pass through. Tomorrow we'll decide how to proceed." Faith nodded, grateful for his consideration. "I'll take the first opportunity to bathe. It feels like I've carried half the trail with me." A hint of a smile touched Garrett's lips. "I won't argue with that plan. I could use a wash myself." They took turns using the washroom. each returning feeling considerably refreshed. Faith had managed to wash her hair and change into her spare dress, while Garrett had shaved and looked more presentable in a clean shirt. Supper was served in the boarding house dining room, where they joined 4 other guests, 2 minors and a middle-aged couple who identified themselves as traveling merchants. Mrs. Holloway provided a hearty meal of roast beef, potatoes, and fresh bread, which Faith devoured with unexpected appetite. Throughout the meal, Garrett maintained their cover as husband and wife, occasionally touching Faith's hand or addressing questions about their journey to Cheyenne. His easy manner and careful attention created a convincing portrait of a caring spouse, and Faith found herself wondering what it might be like if their relationship were genuine rather than a necessary fiction. After dinner, they excused themselves and returned to their room. Night had fallen, and the sounds of the mining town piano music from the saloon, occasional laughter, the distant clang of machinery at the mines that operated around the clock drifted through the partially open window. Garrett stood at the window, peering cautiously through the curtain at the street below. "They're here," he said quietly. Faith joined him, her heart racing. 3 riders were dismounting outside the town's only saloon, their dust-covered clothes and weary postures suggesting they'd ridden hard. She recognized the lead man as Jacob Miller, Wickett's foreman, a hulking figure with a reputation for ruthless efficiency. "Will they check here?" she whispered. "Eventually," Garrett replied. "They'll likely start at the saloon, ask questions. Word travels fast in small towns." "Then we should leave now while they're occupied." Garrett shook his head. "Too risky. They'd spot us on the open road, and night riding in this terrain is dangerous. Our best chance is to wait until dawn, slip out before they're stirring." Faith moved away from the window, sinking onto the edge of the bed. "I'm sorry to have brought this trouble on you, Garrett. You could have been safely on your way to Cheyenne by now." "I made my choice," he said simply, joining her but maintaining a respectful distance. "And I don't regret it." Their eyes met, and Faith felt a curious warmth spreading through her chest. In the soft lamplight, Garrett's features seemed less weathered, his green eyes holding a gentleness that contrasted with his otherwise rugged appearance. The moment was broken by a knock at their door. Both tensed, Garrett's hand moving instinctively to the gun at his hip. "Mr. and Mrs. Quinn." Mrs. Holloway's voice came through the door. "Is everything satisfactory with your room?" Garrett relaxed slightly. "Yes, madam, very comfortable, thank you." "Good, good." "Oh, and there were some men asking after travelers at the saloon. Described a couple that sounds a mite like you two. Friends of yours, perhaps?" Faith and Garrett exchanged alarmed glances. "Not friends, no," Garrett said carefully. "Did you mention us to them?" There was a pause. "Well now, I might have said I had a couple staying here. Didn't give names, mind you." "Is there a problem I should know about?" Garrett moved to the door, opening it slightly to speak to Mrs. Holloway in hushed tones. Faith couldn't hear their conversation, but when he closed the door again, his expression was grim. "She's agreed to tell them she made a mistake, that her guests are an elderly couple heading to Denver, but we need to be gone by first light. They'll check here eventually." Faith nodded, a wave of exhaustion washing over her. The constant tension, the long days in the saddle, and the emotional toll of her abrupt departure from home were catching up to her. "You should rest," Garrett said, noticing her fatigue. "I'll keep watch for a while." Faith wanted to protest, to insist she could take a turn keeping vigil, but the temptation of sleep was too powerful to resist. She lay down on the bed, not even bothering to remove her shoes. "Wake me in a few hours," she murmured. "You need rest too." "I will," Garrett promised, though something in his tone suggested he had no intention of sleeping that night. Faith drifted off to the sound of distant piano music and the reassuring presence of Garrett Quinn sitting vigilant by the window, his silhouette outlined against the star-studded Wyoming sky. She awoke to Garrett gently shaking her shoulder, his voice urgent but quiet. "Faith, we need to go. Now." The room was still dark, with only the faintest hint of pre-dawn light filtering through the window. Faith sat up immediately, instantly alert. "What's happened?" "Miller and his men are making the rounds of the boarding houses," Garrett explained, already gathering their few belongings. "Mrs. Holloway sent her son to warn us. They'll be here within the hour." Faith rose quickly, smoothing her rumpled dress and reaching for her carpet bag. "Where will we go? They'll see us if we take the main road." "There's a back way out of town, follows an old mining trail. It's rough going, but it will lead us north toward Cheyenne eventually." He handed Faith a small bundle. "Mrs. Holloway packed some food for us. We need to move fast." They crept downstairs, finding Mrs. Holloway waiting for them in the kitchen. The older woman pressed a folded piece of paper into Faith's hand. "That's a map to my sister's place in Laramie," she whispered. "Tell her Esther sent you. She'll help you if you need it." "Thank you," Faith said, touched by the woman's kindness to strangers. "Why are you helping us, Mrs.?" Holloway's expression hardened. "I know trouble when I see it, and I know decent folk too. Whatever you're running from, I wish you Godspeed." She opened the back door. "Now go quickly." They slipped out into the pre-dawn darkness, Garrett leading Blaze by the reins to keep the horse quiet until they were safely away from the boarding house. The mining trail Mrs. Holloway had mentioned was little more than a narrow path winding up into the hills behind the settlement. Once they were a safe distance from town, Garrett helped Faith mount Blaze before climbing up behind her. "We'll ride double until we're well clear of Silver Springs," he said. "Then we'll take turns walking to spare Blaze." The trail was indeed rough, forcing them to move slowly despite their need for haste. As the sun rose, casting long shadows across the rugged landscape, Faith found herself constantly glancing behind them, expecting to see their pursuers at any moment. By mid-morning, they had put several miles between themselves and Silver Springs, following a path that took them through dense pine forests and across rocky ridges. The beauty of the Wyoming wilderness would have been breathtaking under different circumstances, but Faith could only focus on the dangers that lurked behind them. "You think we've lost them?" she asked as they paused to rest Blaze near a small mountain stream. Garrett surveyed their back trail, his expression revealing nothing. "Hard to say. Miller's a skilled tracker from what I've heard. If they discover which way we went, they'll follow." Faith felt a chill despite the warm sun. "And if they catch us?" Garrett's hand brushed the revolver at his hip. "They won't take you back to Wickett. I promise you that." The intensity in his voice made Faith realize just how committed Garrett had become to her safety. This was no longer simply a good deed or a chance encounter. He had placed himself firmly between her and harm, willing to face whatever consequences came with that choice. "Garrett," she said softly, "if we make it to Cheyenne." "When we make it to Cheyenne," he corrected. "When we make it to Cheyenne," Faith amended with a small smile. "What happens then? You've done more than enough already. You have your own life, your own plans." Garrett was quiet for a moment, absently running his fingers through Blaze's mane. "I've been thinking about that. Cheyenne's a big enough place that you could disappear for a while, maybe find work as a seamstress or in one of the hotels. Once Wickett gives up the search, you could send for your cousin from Kansas City, make a fresh start." "And you," Faith pressed. "The ranch job I mentioned is real enough. It's about 20 miles outside Cheyenne. Good opportunity, working with quality horses." He met her eyes. "I'd check on you when I could, make sure you're safe." Faith felt a pang of disappointment she couldn't quite explain. Of course, Garrett would continue with his own plans. What had she expected? That he would abandon his future to remain by her side. They barely knew each other, connected only by circumstance and shared danger. Yet in the days they'd traveled together, Faith had begun to feel a connection to this quiet, capable man that went beyond mere gratitude. His protective nature, his unwavering integrity, and the gentle way he treated her despite their precarious situation had awakened feelings she'd never experienced before. "That sounds sensible," she said finally, forcing a smile. "I've imposed on your kindness long enough already." Something flickered in Garrett's eyes, perhaps regret, perhaps something else, but before he could respond, the distant sound of hoofbeats made them both freeze. "Riders coming," Garrett said, pulling Faith away from the stream and into the cover of the trees. "At least 2, maybe 3. They crouched among the pines, Garrett holding Blaze's reins tightly to keep the horse quiet. The hoofbeats grew louder, then slowed as the riders approached the stream. "They've been here," a gruff voice said, Miller's voice. "Tracks are fresh. Which way did they go?" another man asked. "North, still following the trail. They can't be more than an hour ahead of us." Faith's heart hammered in her chest. They were so close. If Blaze made a sound, or if the men decided to search the surrounding area, they would be discovered. Garrett's free hand found hers, squeezing reassuringly. His other hand rested on his revolver, his body tensed for action if necessary. "Should we continue now?" a third voice asked. "We could catch them before nightfall." There was a pause, and Faith could imagine Miller considering their options. "No," he said finally. "The trail narrows ahead, follows a ridge with steep drops on both sides. Better to catch them there, where they'll have nowhere to run. We'll rest the horses here, give them a little more lead. They'll think they've lost us." Faith and Garrett exchanged worried glances. The trap Miller described would indeed leave them with few options for escape. They remained motionless as Miller and his men dismounted, allowing their horses to drink from the stream. The minutes stretched endlessly as the men rested, occasionally speaking in low voices about their pursuit and what Wickett had promised them for returning Faith to Pueblo. "Boss wants her back unmarked," Miller said at one point. "The drifter, though, we can do as we please with him." The casual way he discussed violence sent a shiver through Faith. She looked at Garrett, silently communicating her fear, and found his expression resolute. Whatever happened, he would not surrender easily. Finally, after what seemed like hours but was likely only 30 minutes, the men remounted and continued along the trail, heading north in the direction Garrett and Faith had been traveling. They waited until the sound of hoofbeats had completely faded before emerging from their hiding place. "They're setting a trap ahead," Faith said, her voice trembling slightly. Garrett nodded, studying the terrain around them. "We can't continue on this trail. They'll be waiting for us at the ridge. Is there another way to Cheyenne?" "There's always another way," Garrett said, a hint of grim humor in his voice. He pulled a small compass from his pocket, checking their position. "We'll head northeast, cut through the forest, and try to pick up the main road further north, past where they'll be waiting." Faith hesitated. "The forest looks dense. Can we make it through with Blaze? It'll be slow going, but yes, Blaze has seen worse terrain." Garrett helped Faith mount, then swung up behind her. "We'll put some distance between us and this spot, then find a place to wait out the day. Better to travel by night from here on." As they moved deeper into the pine forest, leaving the trail behind, Faith couldn't help but wonder what would happen if they didn't make it to Cheyenne, or what would happen if they did. The future had never seemed so uncertain, yet paradoxically, she had never felt more alive. With Garrett's solid presence at her back and the vast Wyoming wilderness stretching before them, Faith found herself facing that uncertainty not with fear, but with a growing sense of possibility. The forest grew denser as they pushed northeast, forcing them to dismount and lead Blaze through particularly tight passages between the trees. Progress was painfully slow, and Faith could sense Garrett's growing concern as the afternoon wore on. "We need to find shelter before dark," he said, scanning the forest around them. "A place we can defend if necessary." Faith nodded, her legs aching from the uneven terrain. They had been traveling for hours without a proper rest, the constant fear of pursuit driving them forward despite their exhaustion. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows through the trees, Garrett spotted what they needed: a small clearing bordered on one side by a rocky outcropping that formed a natural shelter. "There," he said, pointing. "We can rest there, wait until nightfall." They made their way to the clearing, where Garrett helped Faith settle against the rocks while he tended to Blaze, removing the saddle to give the faithful horse a much-needed rest. The small bundle of food misses. Holloway had provided bread, cheese, and dried apple slices became their dinner, eaten in weary silence as twilight descended around them. "You should try to sleep," Garrett said, noticing Faith's drooping eyelids. "I'll keep watch." "You haven't slept either," Faith protested weakly. "You can't keep going like this." A ghost of a smile crossed Garrett's face. "I've gone longer without sleep during the war. A few more hours won't hurt me." Faith wanted to argue further but found she lacked the energy. Instead, she settled more comfortably against the rocks, using her carpetbag as a makeshift pillow. "Wake me if anything happens," she murmured, already drifting toward sleep. She wasn't sure how long she slept, perhaps 2 or 3 hours, before being jolted awake by Garrett's hand over her mouth, his eyes warning her to remain silent. Night had fully fallen, with only a sliver of moon providing any illumination. Faith nodded to show she understood, and Garrett removed his hand, pointing toward the trees at the edge of the clearing. For a moment, she saw nothing. Then a shadow moved, a man on foot, moving cautiously through the forest. One of Miller's men, scouting the area. Somehow, they had figured out that Faith and Garrett had left the trail. Garrett motioned for Faith to remain absolutely still as he slowly, silently drew his revolver. The scout was moving parallel to their position, not approaching directly but close enough that any sudden movement or sound would give them away. Faith barely breathed, her eyes locked on the shadowy figure as he paused, kneeling to examine something on the ground. Had he found their tracks? She glanced at Garrett, who was watching the man with predatory focus, clearly calculating whether to confront him or hope he moved on without discovering their hiding place. The decision was made for them when Blaze, tethered nearby, shifted his weight and snorted softly. The scout's head jerked up, his hand dropping to his sidearm as he peered into the darkness toward their position. "Hello," he called. "Who's there?" Garrett moved with startling speed, closing the distance to the scout before the man could draw his weapon. There was a brief struggle, ending with a dull thud as Garrett struck the man with the butt of his revolver. The scout crumpled to the ground, unconscious but alive. "We need to move," Garrett said urgently, returning to Faith. "Now. He wasn't alone, the others will come looking for him soon." Faith scrambled to her feet, helping Garrett quickly saddle Blaze while keeping an eye on the unconscious scout. "What about him?" she asked. "He'll wake up with a headache, but he'll live," Garrett replied, tightening the saddle cinch. "By then, we'll be long gone." They mounted Blaze, Garrett taking the reins as they set off through the forest, no longer concerned with stealth but with speed. The moon provided just enough light to navigate between the trees, though branches occasionally snagged at their clothing and scratched exposed skin. After nearly an hour of hard riding, they emerged from the forest onto a wide, grassy plateau that stretched northward. In the distance, Faith could see the silhouette of mountains against the starlit sky. "The main road to Cheyenne should be about 5 miles east of here," Garrett said, slowing Blaze to a more sustainable pace. "We'll reach it by dawn if we keep moving." "And Miller?" Faith asked, glancing behind them. "Once they find their scout, they'll know we've left the forest. They'll search, but in the dark, they can't track us effectively. We have a chance to put significant distance between us before morning." Faith nodded, allowing herself to lean back slightly against Garrett's chest, drawing comfort from his steady presence. "How much further to Cheyenne?" "At least 2 days' ride, maybe 3 depending on conditions." He adjusted his arm around her waist, a protective gesture that had become familiar over their days of travel together. "Are you holding up all right?" "Yes," Faith said, surprising herself with the truth of it. Despite the danger, the exhaustion, and the uncertainty of what awaited them, she felt a strange sense of rightness in this journey with Garrett. "I'm stronger than I look, Mr. Quinn." She felt rather than saw his smile. "I never doubted that for a moment, Miss Norwood." They continued across the plateau under the vast Wyoming sky, the stars wheeling overhead as they pushed eastward toward the main road. Faith found herself studying those stars, marveling at how different the night sky looked here compared to Pueblo, brighter somehow, more immediate, as though she could reach up and touch the glittering points of light. "My mother used to tell me that stars are windows into heaven," she said softly, breaking the comfortable silence between them. "That our loved ones who have passed on look down on us through those windows." Garrett was quiet for a moment. "My father said something similar. He called them spirit fires, each one lit by someone who'd crossed over to help guide those still finding their way." "That's beautiful," Faith said. "Did you lose him recently?" 10 years ago. Influenza took both my parents within a week of each other." His voice held old grief, worn smooth by time. "Rebecca was all the family I had left after that." Faith hesitated, then placed her hand over his where it rested at her waist. "And now?" Garrett seemed to consider the question carefully. "I suppose I'm still finding my way." The simple honesty of his answer touched Faith deeply. Here was a man who had faced loss and hardship, yet continued forward, guided by an inner compass of integrity and purpose. In the short time she'd known him, Garrett Quinn had revealed himself to be everything Harold Wickett was not: kind without weakness, strong without cruelty, protective without possessiveness. As the eastern horizon began to lighten with the first hint of dawn, Faith realized something that both terrified and exhilarated her. She was falling in love with the quiet cowboy who had rescued her from a fate worse than death. A man she barely knew, yet somehow trusted completely. The realization should have frightened her more than it did. After all, wasn't she fleeing one hasty match only to contemplate another? But this was different. Whatever grew between her and Garrett would be her choice, not a transaction, not a debt paid, but a free and willing decision. Whether he could ever return such feelings remained to be seen. For now, it was enough to ride beside him under the fading stars, heading toward an uncertain future that, for the first time in her life, belonged entirely to her. They reached the main road to Cheyenne just as the sun crested the eastern mountains, bathing the landscape in golden light. The road was little more than a wide dirt track, but it represented civilization and potentially safety. "We'll follow this north," Garrett said, surveying the empty road. "There should be a way station about 15 miles ahead where we can rest properly and get fresh supplies." Faith nodded, relieved at the prospect of a real meal and perhaps even a bed, however briefly. "Do you think Miller and his men will check the road?" "Eventually," Garrett admitted. "But they can't watch every mile of it. Our best chance is to keep moving, stay ahead of them." They continued northward, alternating between riding and walking to spare Blaze. The day grew warmer, the Wyoming summer sun beating down relentlessly, but Faith found the heat preferable to the constant chill of fear that had accompanied them through the forest. By mid-afternoon, they spotted the way station. Garrett had mentioned a collection of simple buildings surrounding a central well, with corrals for livestock and a small general store. A stagecoach was parked outside the main building, passengers milling about as fresh horses were hitched to the vehicle. "Perfect timing," Garrett said as they approached. "That stage is likely heading to Cheyenne. If we can secure passage, we'll reach the city much faster than on horseback." Faith's heart leaped at the possibility. "What about Blaze? I can sell him to the station keeper. He's a good horse. They'll be happy to have him for the relay teams." There was regret in Garrett's voice. He'd clearly grown attached to the stallion during their journey. They dismounted at the edge of the station, Garrett quickly assessing the situation before approaching the stagecoach driver, a weathered man with a thick gray beard. "Afternoon," Garrett called. "That stage bound for Cheyenne." The driver nodded. "Making good time, too, if these replacement nags are up to snuff. You looking for passage?" "For two," Garrett confirmed. "My wife and I need to reach Cheyenne urgently. Family matter." The driver scratched his beard. "Got room for two if you don't mind a tight squeeze." $3 each, payable now. Garrett counted out the money from his dwindling funds and the driver nodded toward the coach. "We leave in 15 minutes. Don't be late." While Faith waited with their belongings, Garrett led Blaze to the station keeper to negotiate a sale. She watched as he stroked the horse's neck one last time before handing over the reins, a gesture of farewell to the faithful animal that had carried them so far. When he returned, his expression was stoic, but Faith could see the sentiment behind it. "Was it a fair price?" she asked. "Fair enough," Garrett replied. "Enough to see us comfortably to Cheyenne with some left over." He glanced at the stagecoach. "It'll be a rough ride, but faster and safer than continuing on horseback." They boarded the coach minutes later, joining 4 other passengers, a middle-aged couple returning to Cheyenne after visiting relatives, a young minister heading to his new congregation, and a traveling salesman with a case of patent medicines. The space was indeed tight, with Faith pressed against Garrett's side on the narrow seat. As the stage lurched into motion, Faith found herself oddly reluctant to reach Cheyenne. Despite the dangers and hardships of their journey, there had been a simplicity to it, just the two of them against the wilderness and their pursuers, learning to rely on each other completely. In Cheyenne, reality would intrude. Garrett would take his position at the ranch, while Faith would need to find work and lodging in an unfamiliar city. Their paths would inevitably diverge, their connection weakened by distance and circumstance. Unless Faith pushed the thought away. It was too soon, too presumptuous to hope for more than the protection and friendship Garrett had already offered. Whatever feelings might be growing within her heart, she had no right to burden him with them, not when he had already sacrificed so much on her behalf. The stagecoach rumbled northward through the Wyoming landscape, each mile bringing them closer to Cheyenne and the uncertain future that awaited them there. Faith leaned her head against Garrett's shoulder, allowing the rhythm of the coach to lull her into a light doze, treasuring these final hours of closeness before their journey came to an end. She was awakened sometime later by the coach coming to an abrupt halt, nearly throwing her from her seat. Garrett's arm steadied her as the driver's voice called out. Roads blocked ahead, fallen tree across the path. Faith exchanged a worried glance with Garrett, whose expression had immediately turned vigilant. "Stay here," he murmured, reaching for the door. But before he could open it, The sound of multiple guns being cocked froze everyone in the coach. "Nobody move," a harsh voice commanded from outside. "We just want 2 of your passengers. The rest of you can continue on your way." Faith's blood ran cold. She knew that voice Jacob Miller had found them. Garrett's hand moved to his revolver, but Faith grabbed his wrist, shaking her head frantically. There were innocent people in the coach who would be caught in any crossfire. The door was yanked open, revealing Miller standing there with a shotgun, 2 more armed men flanking him. "Well, well," Miller said, a cruel smile spreading across his weathered face. "Miss Norwood, Mr. Quinn, Mr. Wickett sends his regards." The other passengers shrank back, clearly wanting no part of whatever conflict was unfolding. The minister made a small sound of distress, while the traveling salesman pressed himself against the far side of the coach. "This doesn't involve these people," Garrett said evenly. "Let them continue their journey." Miller considered this, then nodded. "Fair enough, you 2 out. The rest of you sit tight until we're gone." Faith felt frozen, terror gripping her at the thought of being returned to Wickett. But Garrett squeezed her hand reassuringly before slowly moving toward the door. She followed, legs trembling beneath her as they stepped down from the coach. Outside, she could see that the fallen tree was actually a log that had been deliberately dragged across the road. Miller's 3rd man held the reins of 3 horses a short distance away. "Driver," Miller called, "once we're clear, you can move that log and be on your way. Tell folks in Cheyenne you were delayed by a washout if anyone asks." The driver nodded nervously, clearly unwilling to challenge armed men for the sake of 2 strangers. Miller gestured with his shotgun. "Over by the horses, both of you. Nice and slow." Faith and Garrett moved as directed, though she noticed Garrett scanning their surroundings, likely looking for any opportunity to turn the situation to their advantage. But with 3 armed men keeping careful watch, escape seemed impossible. "Mr. Wickett's going to be mighty pleased," Miller said, addressing Faith directly. "Been in quite a state since you ran off, Miss Norwood. Wedding all arranged and no bride to be found." "I won't marry him," Faith said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. "You can drag me back to Pueblo, but I will never consent to be his wife." Miller chuckled. "Doesn't much matter what you want, miss. Your father signed the papers, and Mr. Wickett ain't a man who takes disappointment well." He turned his attention to Garrett. "As for you, Drifter, Mr. Wickett has special plans. Interfering with a man's property has consequences in these parts." Garrett's expression remained impassive, but Faith could see the tension in his jaw. "Faith Norwood is no man's property," he said quietly. "She's a free woman with the right to choose her own path." "Noble sentiments," Miller sneered. "Won't count for much when Wickett's men are done with you." He gestured to one of his companions. "Tie their hands. We ride for Pueblo immediately." The man approached with a length of rope, but before he could reach them, the sound of approaching riders made everyone turn. A cloud of dust appeared on the horizon, coming from the direction of Cheyenne. "Patrol," Miller cursed. "Wyoming Territory Rangers." He quickly reassessed the situation. "Change of plans. We take them now, ride hard for the territorial border. Wickett's men will meet us there." Events unfolded with frightening speed after that. Faith was roughly grabbed by one of Miller's men while another moved to secure Garrett. But Garrett was waiting for exactly such a moment of distraction. In a fluid movement, he drew his revolver and fired a single shot into the air. The unexpected noise spooked the horses, one of them rearing and pulling free from its tether. Simultaneously, Garrett shoved Faith away from her captor and toward the cover of the stage coach. "Run!" he shouted, firing again, this time at Miller, who ducked behind a water barrel. Faith scrambled toward the coach as bullets whizzed past her. The driver and passengers were shouting in alarm, the horses hitched to the stage stomping nervously at the gunfire. She reached the relative safety of the coach's far side just as Garrett fired a third shot, hitting one of Miller's men in the shoulder. The man dropped his weapon, howling in pain. Miller and his remaining unhurt man returned fire, forcing Garrett to dive behind a stack of freight waiting to be loaded onto the next stage coach. The wooden crates provided temporary cover, but Faith could see they wouldn't last long against determined attackers. Meanwhile, the dust cloud on the horizon was growing larger. The patrol was drawing closer by the minute. If they could hold out just a little longer. Miller seemed to realize this too. "Finish this," he shouted to his uninjured companion. "We can't be caught here." The man moved to flank Garrett's position, while Miller provided covering fire. Faith watched in horror, feeling utterly helpless until her gaze fell on the driver's shotgun, propped against the coach wheel where he'd left it in the confusion. Without allowing herself time to think, Faith grabbed the weapon and raised it shakily. She had fired a rifle exactly once in her life, during a county fair shooting contest years ago, but the basic principle couldn't be that different. Taking a deep breath, she aimed at the ground near the feet of the man trying to flank Garrett and pulled the trigger. The shotgun's kick nearly knocked her over, but the shot had the desired effect. The man yelled in surprise as pellets sprayed the dirt around him, forcing him to retreat back toward Miller. The distraction gave Garrett the opening he needed. He broke from cover, firing twice in quick succession. One shot went wide, but the other caught Miller's remaining ally in the leg, dropping him to the ground. Now it was just Miller against Garrett, and Miller knew the odds had turned against him. With a curse, he made a dash for the remaining horse, firing wildly behind him as he ran. Garrett stepped into the open, taking careful aim, but before he could fire, Miller reached his horse and swung into the saddle. With a final venomous glance back at them, he spurred the animal hard, galloping away from the scene just as the patrol's 6 mounted rangers came into view. "Are you hurt?" Garrett asked urgently, reaching Faith's side and gently taking the shotgun from her trembling hands. Faith shook her head, suddenly finding it difficult to speak. The reality of what had just happened, how close they had come to being captured, or worse, hit her all at once, and she swayed on her feet. Garrett caught her before she could fall, his strong arms enfolding her in a protective embrace. "It's over," he murmured against her hair. "You're safe now." And in that moment, despite the chaos around them, the approaching rangers, the injured men on the ground, the frightened passengers peering out from the stagecoach, Faith knew that Garrett was right. For the first time since fleeing Pueblo, she truly believed she was safe. She also knew, with sudden, absolute certainty, that she never wanted to leave the shelter of Garrett Quinn's arms. The Wyoming Territory Rangers were efficient and thorough, taking statements from everyone involved and providing medical attention to Miller's injured men. The patrol leader, a stern-faced man named Captain Reynolds, listened carefully to Garrett's explanation of the situation, occasionally making notes in a small leather-bound book. "So this Harold Wickett arranged your kidnapping, Miss Norwood?" he asked, turning his attention to Faith. "Yes, sir," she replied. "I was being forced to marry him against my will. Mr. Quinn helped me escape." Captain Reynolds nodded thoughtfully. "Wickett has no authority in Wyoming Territory, but I've heard of him. His reputation extends beyond Colorado." He glanced at the injured men, who were being loaded into a supply wagon the Rangers had brought. "These men will face charges of attempted kidnapping and assault. As for the one who escaped Miller, you called him. We'll send word to patrols along the border to watch for him." "What about Faith's safety?" Garrett asked. "Wickett won't give up easily." "Once you reach Cheyenne, you'll be under the protection of territorial law," Reynolds assured them. Wickett would be a fool to pursue the matter further. He closed his notebook. "We can escort you to Cheyenne if you wish." Garrett glanced at Faith, who nodded gratefully. "We'd appreciate that, Captain," Garrett said. With the Rangers' protection, the journey to Cheyenne proceeded without further incident. The stagecoach passengers, though shaken by the experience, treated Faith and Garrett with a mixture of awe and respect for their handling of the situation. The minister even offered a prayer of thanksgiving for their deliverance from danger, which Faith accepted with genuine gratitude. By late afternoon the following day, the spires and rooftops of Cheyenne came into view, a bustling frontier city that served as the territorial capital. After days of wilderness and constant danger, the sight of civilization was both welcome and somewhat jarring. The stagecoach depot was located near the center of town, surrounded by hotels, saloons, and various businesses catering to travelers. As they disembarked, Captain Reynolds approached them one last time. "I've sent word to Sheriff Donovan about your situation," he informed them. "He'll keep an eye out for any of Wickett's men who might come looking for trouble. The Cattleman's Hotel across the street is reputable and secure. I'd recommend staying there until you get your bearings." Faith thanked him sincerely for all his assistance, as did Garrett. With a tip of his hat, Reynolds rejoined his men, and Faith found herself standing with Garrett on the busy street, their journey officially at an end. An awkward silence fell between them, neither quite ready for the farewell that seemed inevitable. "The Cattleman sounds reasonable," Garrett said finally. "I'll escort you there, make sure you're settled." Faith nodded, unable to express the turbulent emotions swirling within her. They crossed the street together, entering a handsome three-story building with a polished oak reception desk and comfortable-looking chairs in the lobby. "2 rooms, please," Garrett told the clerk, placing some of Blaze's sale money on the counter. "Adjoining, sir?" the clerk asked, glancing between them. Garrett hesitated, looking to Faith for guidance. "Yes," she said before she could lose her courage. "Adjoining would be best." The clerk nodded, retrieving 2 keys from a wall of hooks behind him. "Rooms 214 and 216, second floor. Dining room serves supper from 5 to 8. Anything else you need?" "Information," Garrett said. "I'm to meet a Mr. Lawrence Whitfield about a position on his ranch. Do you know where I might find him?" The clerk brightened. "Mr. Whitfield? Certainly. He owns the Double W, about 20 miles northwest of town. Keeps an office above the bank on Sherman Street when he's in Cheyenne, which is most Tuesdays for the cattle auction." "Thank you," Garrett said, accepting the keys and guiding Faith toward the stairs. Their rooms were simple but clean, each containing a bed, washstand, small writing desk, and wardrobe. The adjoining door between them remained closed for now, a symbolic barrier that Faith wasn't yet brave enough to address. "You should rest," Garrett suggested, lingering in the doorway of her room. "It's been a long journey." Faith nodded, suddenly feeling the exhaustion of the past days catch up with her. "What will you do?" "Find Whitfield's office, confirm the position is still available." He hesitated. "And then we should discuss your plans. Cheyenne is a growing city. There should be opportunities for a woman of your talents." "My talents," Faith repeated, unsure what he meant. A faint smile touched Garrett's lips. "I've seen how capable you are, Faith. How quick-thinking, how resilient. Any establishment in Cheyenne would be fortunate to have you." The compliment warmed her, but it also emphasized the diverging paths that lay before them. Garrett would go to his ranch job, while she would find work in the city. They would drift apart, perhaps exchanging letters occasionally until even that connection faded, unless she found the courage to speak the truth that had been growing in her heart throughout their journey. "Garrett," she began, her voice unexpectedly steady, "before you go, There's something I need to say." He waited, his green eyes watching her with that quiet intensity she had come to treasure. "These past days have been the most frightening of my life," Faith continued. "But they've also been the most real. For the first time, I've made my own choices, faced consequences, discovered what I'm capable of." She took a step toward him. "And I've discovered something else too, something I never expected to find while fleeing a forced marriage." Garrett remained silent, but Faith could see something changing in his expression, a cautious hope taking root. "I've found that I care for you, Garrett Quinn," she said softly. "Not just as my protector or my rescuer, but as a man of honor and kindness. A man I would choose, freely and with my whole heart, if I were given the chance." The silence that followed her declaration seemed endless, though it likely lasted only seconds. Garrett's expression shifted through a range of emotions: surprise, tenderness, and finally a profound joy that transformed his features. "Faith," he said, his voice rough with feeling, "when I saw you that first day in Pueblo standing up to Wickett despite your fear, I knew you were someone extraordinary. Every day since has only confirmed that impression." He took her hands in his. "I've spent years drifting from place to place, never staying long enough to form attachments. But from the moment I decided to help you, something changed. For the first time, I found myself wanting to build something lasting, a home, a future." His eyes held hers. "A life with you if you'll have me." Faith felt tears of relief and happiness welling in her eyes. "I will," she whispered. "I will." Garrett's hand gently cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped. "It won't be easy," he warned. "The ranch position offers a good wage but modest accommodations, and there's always the possibility that Wickett might not give up so easily." "I'm not afraid," Faith said, and realized it was true. With Garrett beside her, she could face whatever challenges lay ahead. "Whatever comes, we'll face it together." His smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "Together," he agreed, and then he was kissing her gently at first, then with growing passion as Faith responded, her arms sliding around his neck to draw him closer. When they finally parted, both breathless, Garrett rested his forehead against hers. "I should still speak with Whitfield," he said reluctantly. "Secure our future." Faith nodded, releasing him but keeping hold of one hand. "Go, I'll be here when you return." With a final squeeze of her hand, Garrett departed, leaving Faith alone with thoughts that swirled like autumn leaves in a gentle breeze. She moved to the window, gazing out at the bustling streets of Cheyenne, a city that had been merely a destination, but was now the beginning of a new chapter in her life. A life with Garrett Quinn. The thought filled her with a happiness so profound, it was almost overwhelming. She was still standing at the window when a knock at her door startled her from her reverie. Thinking Garrett had returned sooner than expected, she opened it without hesitation, only to find herself facing Harold Wickett. Faith stumbled backward, a scream rising in her throat, but Wickett was faster. He shoved his way into the room, closing the door behind him with one hand while the other clamped over her mouth. "Not a sound," he growled, his face twisted with rage. "You've led me on quite a chase, my dear." Faith struggled against his grip, but Wickett was surprisingly strong for his age. He forced her further into the room, only removing his hand from her mouth when the threat of being overheard had diminished. "How did you find me?" Faith demanded, trying to keep fear from overwhelming her. "Money talks, my dear, even in Wyoming territory." Wickett's smile was cold. "Miller may have failed, but he managed to send word of your destination before those rangers apprehended him. After that, it was simply a matter of arriving in Cheyenne and asking the right questions with sufficient incentive for helpful answers." Faith's mind raced. Garrett would return eventually, but Wickett could force her from the hotel long before then. She needed to stall. "What do you want, Mr. Wickett?" she asked, though she knew the answer. "You know precisely what I want. Your promise to me, Faith. Your father's debts remain unpaid, and I intend to collect what's due." He reached into his coat, withdrawing a small revolver. "Now, we're going to walk calmly out of this hotel and board my carriage. If you make a scene, I'll be forced to use this not on you, but on anyone who tries to interfere, including your cowboy when he returns." The threat against Garrett galvanized Faith. She would not let Wickett hurt him, not after everything they had survived together. "Very well," she said, feigning resignation. "Let me gather my things." Wickett nodded, clearly pleased by her apparent capitulation. "Quickly now." Faith moved to the washstand, where she had left her small carpet-bag. As she reached for it, her fingers closed around the heavy ceramic water pitcher sitting beside the basin. In one fluid motion, she swung around, bringing the pitcher down on Wickett's arm with all her strength. He howled in pain, the revolver clattering to the floor as the pitcher shattered. Faith lunged for the weapon, but Wickett recovered faster than she anticipated. He kicked the gun away and grabbed her by the hair, yanking her backward with brutal force. "You'll pay for that," he snarled, his composure shattered by rage. "I intended to be a generous husband, but now you'll learn your place through harsher methods." Faith fought against his grip, clawing at his hand and face, but Wickett was beyond reason now. He slapped her hard across the face, the blow sending her sprawling onto the bed. "Enough," he shouted. "We're leaving now, with or without your cooperation." As he advanced toward her, the adjoining door burst open. Garrett stood there, his expression murderous as he took in the scene before him. Faith on the bed, her cheek reddened from Wickett's blow, and Wickett himself looming over her. "Step away from her," Garrett commanded, his voice deadly quiet. Wickett spun around, reaching for the fallen revolver, but Garrett was faster. His fist connected with Wickett's jaw with a sickening crack, sending the older man staggering backward. But Wickett was not without resources. Despite his age, he had survived in a ruthless business through cunning and viciousness. He regained his balance and charged Garrett, driving him back against the wall with surprising strength. The two men grappled fiercely, Wickett landing several blows to Garrett's ribs while Garrett fought to gain leverage. Faith scrambled off the bed, searching frantically for the revolver Wickett had dropped. She spotted it beneath the writing desk, and dove for it just as the fighting men crashed into the washstand, sending the basin shattering across the floor. Wickett had produced a knife from somewhere and was trying to drive it toward Garrett's throat, while Garrett held his wrist, the blade hovering inches from his face. Faith raised the revolver with shaking hands. "Let him go," she commanded, cocking the hammer. Wickett froze, his eyes darting to Faith. Seeing the determination in her face, he slowly released his grip on the knife, allowing Garrett to knock it from his hand. "It's over, Wickett," Garrett said, breathing heavily as he pushed the older man away. "Faith has made her choice, and it isn't you." "This changes nothing," Wickett hissed, his face flushed with fury. "Her father's debts will be paid," came a new voice from the doorway. They all turned to see Sheriff Donovan standing there, accompanied by two deputies and, surprisingly, Captain Reynolds of the Rangers. "Harold Wickett," Reynolds said formally, "you're under arrest for attempted kidnapping, assault, and crossing state lines with intent to commit a crime." "This is absurd," Wickett spluttered. "The woman is my fiancée." "Not according to her," Sheriff Donovan said dryly. "And forcing a woman against her will is a crime in Wyoming territory, regardless of any arrangement you might have with her father." He nodded to his deputies, who moved forward to take Wickett into custody. As they led the protesting man away, Captain Reynolds approached Faith and Garrett. "Fortunate timing," he observed. "I was reporting to Sheriff Donovan about yesterday's incident when word came that Wickett had been seen in town, asking about a young couple matching your description." "Thank you," Faith said fervently. "Both of you. What will happen to him?" Garrett asked, his arm protectively around Faith's shoulders. "He'll stand trial here in Wyoming," Donovan explained. "The territorial judges take a dim view of men who force themselves on unwilling women. I'd expect a substantial sentence." He looked at Faith. "As for your father's debts, Miss Norwood, I suggest a lawyer might find Wickett's methods of lending constitute usury, which could invalidate the contracts entirely." Hope flared in Faith's heart at this unexpected possibility. "My parents, they could be free of him too." "Worth investigating," Donovan confirmed. "I can recommend a good attorney if you wish." After the law officers departed, Faith and Garrett were left alone in the room, which bore ample evidence of the violent confrontation: broken ceramic, overturned furniture, and spots of blood on the floor where Garrett's blows had split Wickett's lip. "Are you hurt?" Garrett asked, gently examining the reddened mark on Faith's cheek where Wickett had struck her. "Nothing serious," she assured him. "You arrived just in time." "I never left," Garrett admitted. "Something didn't feel right. I went downstairs but couldn't bring myself to leave the hotel." His expression darkened. "When I heard the commotion—" Faith pressed her fingers to his lips, stopping his words. "You were here when I needed you most. That's all that matters." Garrett gathered her into his arms, holding her as though he might never let go. "I thought I'd lost you," he murmured into her hair, "when I saw him standing over you." "But you didn't lose me," Faith said, drawing back enough to look into his eyes. "And you never will." The fierce certainty in her voice seemed to center him. Garrett took a deep breath, then reached into his pocket, producing a small, simple gold band. "I was going to wait until I'd spoken with Whitfield, until I could offer you a proper home," he said, his voice low and earnest. "But after today, I don't want to wait another moment." He held out the ring. "Faith Norwood, will you marry me? Not because any contract demands it, not because of debt or obligation, but because I love you with every breath in my body." Tears spilled down Faith's cheeks as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Garrett Quinn. I will marry you because I choose to, because I love you freely and completely." He slid the ring onto her finger where Wickett's gaudy diamond had once rested. This simple band felt right, a perfect circle symbolizing a love without beginning or end. Their lips met in a kiss that held all the promise of their future together, a future built on choice, respect, and love that had been forged in the crucible of danger and discovered on the long road to freedom. 3 months later, Faith stood on the porch of a small but well-built cabin, gazing out at the rolling Wyoming landscape that had become her home. The Double W Ranch spread before her, cattle grazing on distant hills, cowboys moving among them on horseback, and closer to the cabin, a corral where Garrett worked with the half-wild horses that were his special responsibility. She watched with pride as he, gentle but firm with a nervous bay colt, his patience evident even from a distance. Lawrence Whitfield had quickly recognized Garrett's exceptional skill with horses, promoting him to head trainer within weeks of their arrival at the ranch. The position came with this cabin, modest but private, set apart from the bunkhouse where the other hands resided. They had married in Cheyenne, a simple ceremony with Captain Reynolds and Sheriff Donovan as witnesses. The following week, they had received word that, as Donovan had suggested, a lawyer had successfully challenged Wickett's contracts with Thomas Norwood, freeing her parents from their financial bondage to the man. Her mother and father had written, expressing cautious happiness at her marriage and inviting her and Garrett to visit Pueblo, once Wickett's trial was concluded. Faith had responded warmly but made no promises. Perhaps someday they would visit, but for now, she was content with her new life in Wyoming, a life that would soon include another member. Faith's hand drifted to her still flat stomach, where the first signs of their child had begun to make themselves known. She hadn't told Garrett yet, wanting to be certain before sharing news that would change their lives once again. As if sensing her thoughts, Garrett looked up from his work with the colt, spotting her on the porch. He waved, then said something to his assistant before securing the horse and making his way toward the cabin. "Taking a break?" Faith asked as he climbed the porch steps. "Thought I might spend some time with my wife," he replied, pulling her into his arms for a kiss that still made her heart race. "The horses can wait." Faith smiled against his lips. "I have something to tell you." Garrett drew back slightly, studying her face. "Good news or bad?" "The very best," she assured him, taking his hand and placing it over her stomach. "We're going to have a baby, Garrett. Next spring." She watched as understanding dawned in his eyes, followed by a joy so pure it took her breath away. "A baby," he repeated, his voice filled with wonder. "Our baby. Our family," Faith corrected gently. "The one we're building together by choice and with love." Garrett knelt before her, pressing his lips to the place where their child grew. "Hello, little one," he whispered. "Your mother is the bravest, most remarkable woman I've ever known. We're both so lucky to have her." Faith ran her fingers through his hair, overwhelmed by the love that had brought them to this moment, a love born in danger and nurtured through trials, a love that had offered her safety when she needed it most and freedom when it mattered most, a love that was, and always would be, her choice. 10 years later, Faith Quinn stood at the edge of the ranch that was now their own, watching her husband teach their 9-year-old son Thomas to rope a calf while their 6-year-old daughter Rebecca and 4-year-old son James cheered from the fence. The sun was setting over the Wyoming mountains, painting the landscape in the same golden hues that had welcomed them to this territory a decade earlier. Much had changed in those years. With hard work and careful saving, they had purchased this small spread adjacent to the Double W when Whitfield decided to sell off a portion of his land. It wasn't the largest ranch in the territory, but it was profitable, specializing in breeding and training the finest horses in Wyoming, horses that bore the GQ brand, now recognized throughout the Western territories for their quality and temperament. Faith herself had built a reputation as well, establishing a small school on their property where neighboring ranch children and those from the nearest town came for education. Her classes were sought after, parents willing to send their children considerable distances for the privilege of learning from Mrs. Quinn. They had visited Pueblo once, 5 years earlier, finding her parents aged but well, and the town much changed. Harold Wickett, after serving his sentence in Wyoming, had returned to Colorado only to find his business empire crumbling in his absence. He had died the previous winter, alone and largely unmourned, his vast holdings divided among creditors and distant relatives. That visit had brought closure to the final chapter of Faith's former life. Standing now on her own land, watching her family thrive in the freedom they had created together, she knew she had found something far more precious than the security Wickett had once promised. She had found love that protected without possessing, strength that supported without dominating, and a partner who treasured her independence as much as her companionship. Garrett looked up from his roping lesson, catching her eye across the distance. Even after 10 years, that simple connection still sent warmth spreading through her chest. He said something to Thomas, then made his way toward her, his stride as confident and steady as it had been the day they met. "Penny for your thoughts, Mrs. Quinn," he asked, Wrapping his arms around her from behind, Faith leaned back against his chest, watching their children continue their play. "I was just thinking about choices," she said, "and how one decision can change the entire course of a life. Having regrets." He teased, though she could hear the genuine question beneath. Faith turned in his arms, raising a hand to trace the lines that a decade of Wyoming sun and wind had etched around his eyes, lines she loved because each represented a smile shared, a challenge overcome, a moment lived fully. "Not a single one," she assured him. "Every choice led me here, to you and our children, to this land and this life. I wouldn't change a moment of it." "Not even the dangerous parts?" Garrett asked, his expression growing serious as he remembered those fraught days of their journey north. "Not even those," Faith confirmed, "because they showed me who you truly are and who I could be when I found the courage to choose my own path." She rose on tiptoe to brush her lips against his. "And I would choose you again, Garrett Quinn, every day for the rest of my life." As the Wyoming sunset bathed them in golden light, and their children's laughter echoed across the ranch that was their home, Faith knew that the promise her father had made so long ago, a promise that had once threatened to shackle her to a life of misery, had ultimately led her to the greatest freedom she could have imagined. The freedom to love and be loved, not out of obligation or fear, but out of choice and devotion that grew stronger with each passing day. In Garrett's arms, in the home they had built together, Faith Norwood Quinn had found not just safety, but something far more precious. She had found herself, and in doing so, had found everything.